Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I am opening the first lecture of the Philosophy 300 course. And so I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about introductions and things about what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks. This is a very good course. I think you will come away thinking in new ways about the human mind and how we operate. And our textbook is a little bit deceptive in that it talks mostly about psychology and not philosophy. So I wanted to spend some time talking about the rationale of why we talk about psychology with philosophy. It's only been the last 200 years that we have actually been thinking about how we think and how we operate. That's hard to believe because we tend to look back on history and read into history that things have always been like they are now, but they have not. Most people are amazed to learn that we've not even had germ theory a little over 150 years. We didn't even know what germs were and what they were doing. And so it's important for us to understand that most of what we know, we have probably learned in the last 200 years. Psychology was not even a field until the late 1800s. And a lot of these things came from the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was a period in which man began to apply reason to everything that they did, as opposed to faith as they'd done in the past, where everything was based on faith. But now everything comes to be based on reason. And with that, we begin to ask questions about the human mind, about what a baby comes into the world with, as far as what they know to begin with. And then the whole developmental process as we go through our lifespan, the whole developmental stages that we go through. You might be surprised to learn that at every age in your life or every stage in your life, you are thinking differently, acting differently, doing differently. And so there's an entire psychology that has developed around those developmental stages. One of the things you're talking about in your discussion board this week are the idea of the tabula rasa, the idea that a baby, an infant, comes into the world with a blank slate, and that we write on that slate, that we produce in that child the ability to learn, the ability to grow, the ability to interact. All those things are not inborn. They're not in the genetics. They are in the learning. And that raises questions about the environment that we live in and whether that environment is good or bad, has a direct effect upon children. You may have experienced that yourself. You might have grown up in a home that was chaotic and out of the ordinary, and as a result, it's affected you, slowed you down in many ways as you've made your way through your life. So whatever it is, psychology is an integral part of that. And philosophy is that idea particularly of the mind itself and how we think about thinking, if you will. We're going to talk about several objectives in this 3 weeks that we're together, and I have those here on the board for you to look at. But the analysis of the causes of various individual differences in how we perceive things and how we, that includes development, as I've said, and culture in terms of biology, experience, and interaction. There are probably no two people on the planet that are exactly 100% alike. Even twins will have certain differences in how they perceive the world, how they react to that world, how they think about the world. And so that's important for us to understand. We'll analyze and evaluate the different meanings of consciousness and the corresponding impact on the mind. What does it mean to have conscious and unconscious thoughts? Sigmund Freud came up with those ideas in the late 1880s. He developed the whole field of psychology, that there are unconscious things going on in your mind that are just below the surface, and in times of stress, those things kind of pop up and you do things you would not normally do. But the idea of conscious and unconscious mind is important. Then we'll talk about the biological, social, the cognitive correlation of emotional expression and assessment. Why do you say the things you do? Or why do you act the way you act? Or why do you do the things that you do? All those things are worthy of us thinking about the mind. How does your mind operate? And how do you think? Are you thinking logically? Do you think rationally, reasonably? Are there issues where you don't necessarily do so? So we'll look at all the different models of how we remember things. Memory is a really unique aspect of our lives, and to think that we are able to recall things from our childhood. I can remember things from when I was 3 years old. I remember poems that we remembered in high school. I'm 62 now. So that's been well over 40, 50 years ago with the punctuation, because we're able to embed that upon our memories and recall it in long term. We discussed and analyzed the 4 steps of problem solving that will help incorporate existing research and applying a problem. Those are one of the things that came from the Enlightenment that were of great value, is that we begin to use the scientific method, following the same steps over and over again, and one would expect to get the same results if you do the same thing over and over again. That was beyond the reason for people for hundreds of years, because people weren't educated. They worked. There was no idea of being a genius unless you were also wealthy. All those things have a big role in that. And we'll talk about differentiate the different aspects of self in terms of content, sources, applications. Yourself, you have and that, some people may call that a soul. They may call it a lot of different things, but I think it's all one and the same thing. There is a part of you that, as long as you're living, will be caught up in what you are doing and saying and thinking. If you've ever observed a dead person after they're gone, you realize that there's a sense in which that person is just no longer there. The self is gone, the soul is gone, or whatever you want to call that. So when we think about the science of the mind, that's one of the things we want to talk about in this philosophy class, about what psychology is, what philosophy is, and so we are going to look at different perspectives. So I encourage you to read your textbook, spend some time in those things. And then there has to be a measure of how do we measure things? If you have children, you know that they begin measuring a child from the time it's born. They start out with its length, its weight, the size of its feet. All those things are going to be measured repeatedly. But now we have all of these cognitive measures that they're measuring your child in relation to its age and against its cohorts, the members of its group that are same age and should be at the same level developmentally. And so they're going to be measured all through their lives. It doesn't start with elementary school where you're taking tests and been measured. It starts now from birth. And these are very much important. So they conduct research based off of that. And because of that research, they're able to tell whether a child is fairly up with its peers. I kind of restrain using the word normal because there is probably no real definition of what is normal, but what is comparative? How does it compare with the other children and their actions and reactions and all those different things? And so that's a major part. And so we draw conclusions then from that data, and that helps us to understand how a person thinks, or if they're behind or ahead of their cohort is also important. Another aspect we'll be talking about is the idea of nurture versus nature. What effect does that have on a child when it comes into the world if the environment is wrong, if mom and dad are, if they use drugs or they drink or they curse or they are fighting or whatever, what effect does the environment have on your mindset? I'm sure that many of you could give us a long talk about what you grew up in. Maybe it wasn't an ideal situation. And because of that, you struggle with that today. Most people tend to marry people like their father or their mother. So they perpetuate that down through the generation so that you subject your children to the same kind of environment because that's the only environment that you actually know. And so the building blocks of behavior, good behavior, where do they start and how do they interact? And so there's so many of that. Some things are genetic that are passed down from generation to generation. I'm amazed as I study people and look at people to realize that, what I would think it would be something that a person learned, a learned behavior. There are a lot of behaviors that are genetic and are inborn, and you found those if you have children. They surprise you sometimes. You'll see them acting out behaviors that you've done or somebody else has done. So the behavior of a person has a lot to do with how their mind operates. Then there's a biological basis, of course, and that is we have a physical body with a central nervous system, and we have functions. And so we're going to be talking about that, the nervous system, and how that operates and what that produces. Another part that will figure into psychology is perception, the perceived mind. How you think about yourself is a key entity in how you function in sensation and perception. How do you see, for instance? Charles Darwin, who came up with the very controversial idea of the fitness of man and evolution as you would know it, said the one thing that devalued his theory was the human eye, that it was so intricately made and so delicate that by pure evolution that the eye could never have developed. So how do you see? I mean, what you perceive, what's really interesting is that you and I could look at the same identical object and come away with different perceptions. Maybe you are caught up in looking at the shape of it. I would look at the color or the context or whatever else, how it's acting or reacting, all those things. Perception is a really interesting thing. And of course, in our day, color is a science that's used in advertising. Maybe you don't realize that color can make you hungry or it can make you not hungry. That's why McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's all use red and yellow, because the red and yellow colors are designed to trigger hunger when you see their signs or their advertising. On the other hand, when you go into an all-you-can-eat restaurant, you won't see red and yellow because they don't have an interest in making you hungry. They have an interest in stopping hunger. So they use greens and browns and other sedate colors to keep you from being hungry. They also use a plate that's not nearly as big as a normal plate, but it is a psychological thing that if you've eaten a plate of food, then to go back for a second plate would be somehow, uncouth. So they have a way of controlling the amounts of food that you eat. Or how do you hear? Your ear is the same way. We hear things. There are people, I'm not gifted in music very much. I often say I can't play a radio without static, but there are people that hear things in music that I don't hear, or they see things in plays that I don't see, because they have this perception ability. They're able to perceive good things or what's going on at a level that most of us do not. So what does it mean to be aware? That you're aware of the what's going on around you. I mean, if you've ever been around a person that's in a coma, you realize that they're laying there asleep and their eyes are closed. And many times their mind may be aware of what's going on. They actually encourage you to speak with a person that's in a coma because it may trigger them and pull them out of the coma. But the awareness is a huge thing. There are people that sleepwalk, and you would think they were awake because their conscious state is awake, their mind is asleep, and those kind of things will happen. If you've ever dreamed dreams, to be honest, we've never figured out the purpose of human dreaming. Our Native American friends used to think that your spirit got up and left your body during the night and went out and actually did all those things and came back before sunrise in the morning, got back in your body and went on through the day. Well, I'm not sure about that, but dreams are really interesting. They're so real sometimes. I mean, you dream about dead relatives and you talk to them or whatever, carry on conversations. But there is a consciousness about you as a person. So in this course, we want to talk about and think about what makes you think. And thinking about thinking is quite an interesting way to do that. Your first discussion board is going to be on the idea of the blank slate. And especially those of you that have children, think about how your children came into the world and how you taught them to learn. And how you do that will set them up for a lot of their lives, because they'll continue to learn throughout their lives. You can also intentionally alter the conscious state, of course. You can do that through drugs, you can do it through other things, but the idea is how that you are able to be aware. And so during this time, as we look at philosophy and think about that, a lot of great philosophers have talked about the idea of awareness. What are you aware of? How did we start forming thoughts and ideas? Think about ideas that you come up with that help you to get through life. And those things are very much philosophical. They're things that control that. Our worldview, for instance, will control how we think about certain things. And so, as we move through the process, I hope that you will read your text carefully, pay attention to the exercises, and of course, ask questions as you need to. Respond to your classmates, get all the points that you can, but at the same time, hopefully, we will learn something about what makes us exist as human beings.